Sounds good.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Azure Community Live, episode 24. Today we have guest Isaac Levin from Microsoft, who will talk about GitHub Actions, .NET applications, and Azure. We have our second host tonight, Esteban, who is joining us again. So we have two hosts and one guest. Well, thanks for watching, tuning in again. If you like these streams, please subscribe to our channel, like the channel, so you get updates on all the upcoming streams. So today we will talk about accelerating your .NET applications using GitHub Actions towards Azure. Isaac, can you quickly introduce yourself and then show us the code?
Sure. Yeah, so obviously thank you, Garrett and Esteban, for having me on the stream today. I'm super excited to talk about, three things that are very, very important to me. ASP.NET, .NET, Azure, and GitHub. So for the people who don't know me, my name is Isaac Levin. I'm a senior product marketing manager at Microsoft. What that means is I get to tell great stories about how to get developers enabled onto Azure in super fun ways using our tooling and our DevOps processes. And you can find me on GitHub, Twitter, and Twitch, all under Isaac R. Levin. So feel free to check me out. All right, so I'll just go ahead and get started with the presentation, right? So I've talked a little bit about myself, and I'll talk a little bit more some of the things that I do as a part of my job later. But I wanted to talk about what we do when we try to get our apps to production. So when we talk about getting our apps to production, we think about what we did in the beginning. So I actually opened up a Twitter conversation yesterday about how developers, what they did before this whole, CI/CD DevOps was basically industry norm, right? So, I got some great answers, obviously, some horrific answers. And I think, a great idea is talking about kind of what the timeline of what we've done is. We've all been developers. We've all had to, quote unquote, ship software. So the question is that how has that progressed over time as technology has enabled us to be more efficient in that? So obviously, the first thing that comes to mind if you're an older developer is the concept of copy paste, right? You could easily just RDP or open up a file share on a production server, take your built source code locally, or maybe at some place where you build and then put it to more of a staging environment for your build code, and then you just paste. The issue, obviously, with that is that there's a substantial amount of downtime for your applications, and it's just generally a terrifying experience as somebody who's actually done it. It's no fun to be in a situation where you're changing production bits and people are kind of patiently waiting for you to finish that. If you were fancy, you could do some things like FTP, right? Which is basically just a more elaborate copy and paste. Obviously, same sort of experience there. It's a little bit quicker because there's no I guess you could say keyboard dependency, but there is still a little bit of concern there. And then, as we started to progress into the early 2000s, we started to see these tools start to show up, tools that allowed you to basically hook into miscellaneous things and allow you to more seamlessly deploy your code. The first one that I got started with, and I apologize for the small screenshot here, was Cruise Control. So people that have used Cruise Control, raise your hand. Cruise Control was basically a mechanism that allowed you to hook into built, I guess, bits of your application. You could easily kind of, quote unquote, one-click deploy them to environments. And there was workflows that you can configure in there. And it was pretty valuable, especially, in comparison to copy and paste, but there's still definitely a bit more that you can do. And then Hudson showed up. So if you don't know what Hudson is, Hudson eventually became Jenkins. So the story with Hudson is that it was an open source project and then was eventually purchased by Oracle. And then there were some conversations around, I don't think that this isn't maintaining the charter of what we're trying to do in this particular thing. And then it spun off into Jenkins, which is still a very, very well-known CI/CD process. And then finally, we get to this concept where we actually have real CI/CD tools that are hooked up to repositories. The issue with previous things is previous things like Cruise Control, or even to expect Hudson and Jenkins, is that the source code was somewhere else, and you basically had to either set up webhooks or you had to set up some mechanism that basically grabbed that built code and did things with them. So you had things like Octopus Deploy show up, which gives you more elaborate integrations into that, and then finally things like Visual Studio Team Foundation Server. And then from there, that became 45 different million names of Team Foundation Server. Right now, it sits in the name Azure DevOps Server, or Azure DevOps if you use the cloud version. So the benefit, obviously, to Team Foundation Server and now Azure DevOps is that you have the code or the repos living directly at the same place where you can do your CI/CD. But not every developer uses Team Foundation Server or now Azure DevOps to host their code. A lot of people use GitHub. So what does that mean? So GitHub introduced this concept called GitHub Actions. And the question I think that a lot of people have when you hear GitHub Actions is, what exactly is a GitHub Action? So a GitHub Action is a YAML-powered workflow linked to GitHub repository. So what that means is that there is a file that sits along in the same place as your GitHub repository where your code lives, and it's basically a configuration file that holds the workflows in order to get your application from one place to another. So how do these workflows get triggered? Well, there's a handful of ways. You can set up individual webhooks to different mechanisms. So for instance, if a push happens on a repository, a pull request, you can actually configure schedules using cron jobs, or you even have the ability to one button click kick off these workflows. And all the workflows live inside what we like to call a runner. So a runner is basically a VM hosted in Azure that has a ton of pre-installed tools on there. So GitHub provides runners in the three main, or not three main, I guess you could say, three different types of operating systems. We have a Windows, obviously, Windows Server, and some different configurations of that. Ubuntu, which is your Linux flavor, and then Mac OS. So the tools that exist on runners by default, you have tons of them. So you have Bash. If you're on Ubuntu, you have PowerShell, you have all the Git commands, you even have things like different versions of Java, Node.js, and .NET. So in the situation where you don't want to have a cloud-hosted runner in GitHub, you can provide a runner yourself. So you say, hey, I want this particular machine, this remote machine here, to be my runner, and GitHub will help you configure it. Finally, I think one of the biggest benefits to GitHub Actions is that you can actually see all of the logs for your workflows inside of the GitHub portal. So you can easily go to the Actions tab of GitHub for a repository and see all the different instances where your workflows run and all of the logs provided to them, which is actually super substantial. And finally, obviously with GitHub, the world's biggest community, or not the world's biggest community, but one of the biggest communities in the tech community, is you have this concept of a community marketplace for you can find actions, workflows that people in the community have built for all sorts of different things. And I think that that's really valuable. And we're going to talk through a couple of these actions and workflows that are provided by the community that can provide a ton of value for developers. So the talk is about .NET, right? So how we use GitHub Actions to get our .NET or ASP.NET applications to Azure. So the first thing that we talk about is, okay, so what do you do to set up a GitHub action to use .NET? I mentioned earlier that a lot of the runners, most of them actually, provide some version of .NET, but there might be your application might have some particular requirements that might not be available on those runners. So what setup.net allows you to do is configure your .NET environment. So it's a GitHub action that's owned by GitHub, so you can actually go out and look at the source code for it. And it's basically an action that allows you to configure a .NET CLI environment based on your requirements. So requirements such as, what if I want a specialized version of the .NET SDK? So for instance, if you're using .NET, if all of the existing runners have 3.1, which is the LTS of .NET Core. So for instance, if you want to get access to preview bits, like for instance, .NET 5, which is coming out later this month, In the future, potentially .NET 6, you'll be able to point to those SDK previews and be able to run GitHub Actions that can work against those particular SDKs. Another really valuable feature is that what if you have private package sources? So for instance, you're using private NuGet or GitHub packages or Azure DevOps artifacts. It allows you to configure those environments and authenticate against them seamlessly. So we're talking about GitHub Actions. We're talking about ASP.NET Core. Where can we deploy these applications to? So obviously, I'm going to talk about some Azure services here. The biggest one, obviously, that comes to mind is Azure App Service. Yes, you can easily deploy your applications to Azure App Service, but you also have the ability to deploy using Azure Functions, Azure Static Web Apps, and we're going to go through some examples of all of these as well. Azure Kubernetes Service, which I'm not going to go into because it's a bit complex, and I think it would not be fair to this talk to just take 45 minutes or an hour to show you how Azure Kubernetes Service you can configure GitHub Actions to, because Kubernetes is, it's a bit of a beast. At least to me, it is. Some people probably disagree. But the number one thing, outside of Azure, you can use GitHub Actions to deploy your ASP.NET Core applications basically to anywhere. So if you want to push it to other cloud providers, or if you want to push it to other hosting services, you definitely can. So talking about the different scenarios here, and I can pause if anybody has some particular questions. Are there any questions on chat?
So Martin asks, why would I use GitHub Actions over the built-in YAML of Azure DevOps?
So I think one of the things that's really important to think about is that if you have your code hosted in GitHub, you can easily configure Azure pipelines to connect to GitHub. Like, that's a seamless integration. It's very, very easy inside of Azure DevOps. But there is the situation where you're managing two different environments, right? So you have your Azure DevOps environment that you're managing, which has Azure pipelines, and you also have your source code hosted in a repository. What GitHub Actions allows you to do is have your CI/CD process living in the same place as your code. Obviously, if you have your code hosted in Azure DevOps already, it makes total sense to use Azure pipelines. And obviously, Azure pipelines and Azure DevOps gives you a whole suite of tools right now that GitHub Actions don't have. Obviously, at some point, there's going to be closer feature parity, but right now, Azure DevOps has, substantially more features and more robust, I guess you could say, integrations with other things. GitHub Actions, it's still pretty early in the stream, but I think that if you're having applications that are hosted in GitHub, I think GitHub Actions is a great opportunity for you to learn how to configure CI/CD directly from there.
And also they're quite related, right? So if you are in one, it's quite easy to move to the other one. If you already have pipelines built in YAML and Azure DevOps, it would be fairly easy to move them to GitHub Actions.
Yeah, so that's actually interesting to call out. So there is some differences in schema between Azure pipelines, the YAML schema for Azure pipelines and GitHub Actions. Funny enough, a friend of mine, Sam Smith, actually built a conversion tool. I can provide a link later on when I give out the links. But basically, it's a tool. It's I believe that it's command line based, and I think you might even have a web version of it as well, where you basically say, hey, here's my Azure DevOps pipeline. Here's the YAML file for it, and it will do its best to basically massage that into the new schema. The biggest difference that you really see is that the concept of multi-environment. So with Azure pipelines, you have this experience where you can say, hey, maybe I want to run this particular workflow in 6 or 7 environments. Like, for instance, if you have a .NET Core application that you need to run in Linux and Mac and Windows. So that schema looks a bit different than on the GitHub Actions side. They both exist. They're called matrices in GitHub Actions. But there is some subtle differences just between the nomenclature and what the different values are expected to be. And his tool helps massage that out a little bit. Cool. Anything else?
No, let's continue for now.
Awesome.
If anyone else has questions, just ask them in the chat and I will pass them on to Isaac.
Yeah, for sure. And obviously, I just don't want to talk for 30, 35 minutes completely straight. Like, I want to have a conversation. I know sometimes doing these presentations, especially like virtually, People are a bit more tentative to, call out and ask questions, but please do. If you have questions, not even just about, .NET Core, Actions and Azure, but just DevOps in general, like let's definitely have a conversation around it. Moving forward, we talk about so this is more of a when you would want to use a particular tool. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, the three main services that I'm going to demo: app service, functions, and static web apps, and when you would want to deploy to them from a .NET or ASP.NET perspective. So obviously with app service, if you have a traditional web application, so Razor Pages, MVC, Web API, so forth, even server-side Blazor, you definitely want to take advantage of app service, because app service, it has scalable production workloads, high performance, or you can have even dedicated environments, app service environments that allow you to, scale out your applications in a really, really powerful way. You also have this concept of even though it's a platform as a service, you still have more control over the environment configuration, right? Obviously, if you need the whole OS for whatever reason, like you need to modify registry or whatever, you need to go down the path of VMs. But if you don't need like full control over the OS, but you still want some environment configuration, you have the ability to do so. And then finally, there's a rich feature set that I love about app service. So you can talk about deployment slots, and you can have integrated VNet support and seamless integration with Azure Active Directory. So that's kind of the reasons why I think deploying to app service is really interesting. And I wanted to show people really quick how easy it is to deploy to app service. So I'll hop into a demo real quick. So right now I have I guess a repo that I have for some different things. So right now I have an app service, and there's nothing really fancy about this. I'll just open this up. Let's just open terminal here, and I apologize for some of the font stuff. So if I go to here, make sure that I'm in app service, and then let's do a .NET run here. So I'm just going to show you what the application is. Like the application is your traditional, I think it's actually one of the samples that gets used for building out docs. So let me just show you this. It popped open on another screen, obviously. So this is a very, very familiar page, obviously. You can click on here, and it's the MVC movie store, if anybody has seen that, right? So this is one of the sample applications that if you go through, you build out, basically walking through setting up a typical application. This is the application that gets built, right? So it's not super complex, but it gives you an idea of what you can kind of configure very, very easily using GitHub Actions. So I'm actually going to stop this. Out, and I'll close out my terminal. So there are some amazing GitHub or VS Code extensions that allow you to easily set up GitHub Actions. So one of them is the Azure connection. So is it going to make me sign into app service? That's cool. So I'm going to sign into app service really quick. For whatever reason, it didn't take my credentials last time. So let's hop over here. Let's just paste that in there. No. Yes. All right, now I'm signed in. So if I take a look at some of my app services that I have here, so I already have an existing app service. So I can actually right-click here and configure my deployment source. So if I click that, it's actually going to walk me through a workflow on configuring my CI/CD. So I'm going to click on GitHub. I'm going to choose the organization. So this is the GitHub organization, so that's mine. I'm going to choose a repository, and then I'm going to go down to, oh, I have a private package, so that's hidden. So 1 second. So let's just do that. Do this again. Includes main. So this will actually, you can actually see it's being connected to a repo. I don't want to do that. So what I actually want to do is, I clicked the wrong thing. There we go. Command template, deploy, configure Azure CI/CD pipeline. So I need to provide a GitHub token, which I have over here. Patiently waiting while GitHub logs me in through miscellaneous different things. 1 moment. Waiting. All right. Don't steal my token. It's going to analyze my repository, fetch templates. So if I go here, the next thing that it asks me to do is select a pipeline template. So I want to select an ASP.NET Web App to App Service. I click that. I provide my subscription. I provide the app service that exists. And then what it'll do, setup is already configured because, all right. So it looks like setup is already configured here, which means that I probably just did something earlier and forgot to delete a deployment source. So give me 1 second. So if I go here, I'm just doing something on my other screen. So just killing out my deployment source. So disconnect. Okay. All right, we should be good now. So let's try that again. Apologies, folks. Configure CI/CD pipeline. Put in my Azure token, ASP.web app application, that, pick my web app that I built out, and then it's going to generate a workflow file. So this is actually going to build me a GitHub action based on the information that I provided it, which is actually pretty slick. So it actually builds out and it puts it in my GitHub repo. So as you can see here, let me just make this a little bit smaller. So the GitHub action itself that it creates is not very substantial, right? So, we're setting up MS Build, we're setting up NuGet Restore, we are building our application. So this is for an ASP.NET application. So one thing that I did earlier today is I actually built out one for a web app, and I'll go through and show you what that looks like. But this shows you how easily you can basically build out a GitHub action. So I'm going to walk through this particular GitHub action that I know works with this particular web service. So the thing is that it gets you started building out the scaffolded action, but you probably need to make modifications to it. So just walking through this particular GitHub action really quick. So as you can see, it's going to trigger. So that's what the on means. And then it provides the event. So push. So whenever there's pushes to the master branch, it'll say specify the web app name, where you're going to build out that package, the publishing profile, which you store as a GitHub secret, and then some more configuration things. So then the next thing is you provide what kind of runner you want it to be, which is Ubuntu latest. You configure your .NET Core SDK. In this situation, I'm actually providing the .NET 5 RC, so it'll actually run that. And then restore packages, .NET Restore, publish app, deploy, and so forth, right? So I'm going to save that. And then if we look inside of here, you can see that I can just, so let's just say adding web app action. I'm going to commit this, and then I'm going to push it. I just realized that my branch names are different, so I'll need to fix that in a second. But so I'll change this to main, and then we'll just fix because who cares, and then we'll republish or repush. So if I go over to the repo that I just built, so as you can see here now, there's a GitHub workflow here. So the GitHub workflow, you click on it, and it's everything that we saw here. It even says main, cool. So what you see is that once this commit happens, there's like a little light here, which means that an action is running. So if I can go here, take a look, and then you can actually look in the logs and you can see all the things that my application is doing. Obviously, this is going to probably take a little bit, especially the deploy to Azure Web App. So I'm actually going to move on and we'll come back to it later, but I wanted to show you that you have the ability to see a ton of really, really valuable things. And you can actually see, if I look at the actions, I've actually deployed a lot of actions over the last few days, right? So we can just take a look at one of the ones that I did a couple days ago. And as you can see here, these are all the logs that were built. So it's very, very similar. So I set up the .NET Core SDK, I published the app for deploy, I deployed to the Azure Web App, and so forth, right? So super, super easy to go from application not having CI/CD to application having CI/CD using VS Code, right? So that's super, super valuable. So when we talk about the next thing, which is your why would I want to deploy Azure Functions, right? So Azure Functions, if folks don't know, they're stateless, the ability to run stateless tasks, very small workflows, without having to care about the infrastructure at all. So when I mention stateless, they can be stateful if you configure durable functions. There's a little bit more work there, but you definitely have the ability to do that. When the infrastructure doesn't matter, you definitely want to go down the route of taking a look at functions. So functions are event-driven architecture where you can have triggers and bindings. So if you have non-HTTP related things, you definitely want to take a look at Azure Functions to be able to do that. And finally, Azure Functions are extremely cost effective. I put an asterisk in there because they can get expensive depending on what your needs are. Or not expensive, but they can get more costly than you would expect them to be because there's different plans to run it in. And I want to show another quick demo of deploying to Azure Functions using Visual Studio. So Visual Studio, just like VS Code, has very, very similar experience, right? So here I have just a typical hello function. So if let's just set this as start project and run this. This is just this is basically the scaffolded out, like basic Azure function that you can build. And what it will do is you basically just provide a URL and then you provide your name and it'll say hello back to you. I just wanted to show you that it actually works, but Azure Function Core Tools is taking a little bit of time. There we go. So if I do this, copy this into a browser, put this browser here, and then boom, and then go name equals Isaac. Hello, Isaac, your HTTP triggered function executed successfully, right? So it does work. So what do I want to do if I want to actually configure a GitHub action to an Azure function? You can easily do that inside of Visual Studio. So if I right click on my function that I create and go to publish, it detects that there's an existing workflow in my solution. I can click new. That's for the web app. So if I go Azure Functions, I pick the function that I've already created. It's a consumption function. And then I can go new in Visual Studio. You have, instead of just generating a publishing profile every single time, there's this option now to publish automatically using GitHub Actions, which generates a workflow file. So you click finish. And then just like that, now you have an Azure function configured GitHub action. So you probably noticed that it's very, very similar to the one that you have for GitHub Actions. What's great about all of these different tools is they're all taking advantage of some GitHub actions that are actually maintained by the Azure development team. So if we take a look at, oops, I opened the wrong thing. So you can go to azure.github.io and it'll list you out all of the different GitHub actions that exist, right? I skipped over this, unfortunately, because this is the same one that you can use for the one that I did for app service. And all the code is hosted on GitHub, but you can say, oh, app service, serverless apps, containerized apps, and all of them have scaffolded out experiences. So if I take a look at just the Azure Functions one, for instance, so this is an actual Azure function that was built by the Azure team that allows you to deploy to Azure Functions. So it provides them for .NET, Node, PowerShell, and it shows you all the things you need to do to set this up. So when we look at here, we scroll down, run Azure Functions action, it says Azure Functions -action, right? So that's the Azure function or the GitHub action that we were just looking at. So as you can see here, there's some configuration that we can add here. You can configure .NET build to run, and then that outputs it out, and that puts it into a particular thing, right? So if I take a look, there's a couple of things that I need to change here. I have it in a different file, so I'm going to copy it over here, and then with the magic of copy and paste, you can see it looks very, very similar, but there's a couple of things I just added in there. So if I commit this, let's delete this profile, adding another action. Then we'll commit and sync, and then we'll go back to our repository. in a second, now there's another GitHub function. So what you'll see here over on this side is that now I'm actually kicking off 2 different GitHub Actions at the same time. So that's what's great about GitHub Actions. You can configure many of them for your repositories, and you can actually configure them. I can actually say in the workflow file, hey, I don't want to run this particular action based on a lot of criteria, potentially based on words that you put in the commit or files that were changed in this particular code base. And I just didn't configure that for this particular scenario. But as you can see, it kicks off the action. You can take a look at it. It's building, setting up .NET Core SDK, and then deploying out. So I'm going to pause for a second before I go into static web apps to see if anybody has any questions.
Yeah, it's like one question. So on your YAML file, you had you referenced some secrets. What is that in GitHub terms? How does that work? And how would I add? Where do I find these?
That's a great question. So if you so GitHub Secrets basically allows you to have, I guess you could say, private information that is needed for GitHub Actions to work. Say, for instance, if you, like one of the examples that I showed earlier was I had this concept of a publishing profile, right? So in order for GitHub Actions to be able to deploy to an Azure function, it needs basically credentials to deploy to that Azure function. You obviously don't want to provide that information in code. So what you can actually do is you can add it to what's called a GitHub secret. So every repo, if you go into settings and you go into secrets, you can actually in here configure different secrets. So it's basically you can provide the secret name, provide your value. And what it allows you to do is it allows you to reference them inside of your runner. And how you would do that is you just, so this is the nomenclature for variables. So you can configure tons of variables inside. As you can see here, there's some variables I create here using the env key. Inside here, I'm using secrets, which is a known variable in the GitHub Action runner that's configured. And it looks for this particular publishing profile, and it replaces. So, and one thing to call out too is when you are, sorry, let me open the wrong browser window. So when you actually go in and take a look at actions, just look at one here. Not the right one. I'll go to the one that failed. One second. So you can go in here, and if you go to set up job, it'll show you the virtual environment. You can actually look at all the different variables that you created. So if I run here, so as you can see, let me just zoom in a little bit. So here, this is inside of that particular workflow. So right here where I'm configuring the environment variables, as you can see, there's that publishing profile and it's starred out, which means that it's coming from secrets. So obviously you do not want the publishing profile to be available in the logs of your public GitHub action. So it replaces it with those 3 asterisks. So basically it allows you to insert protected data to be able to configure your GitHub Actions. And I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Was there anything else?
Yeah, something I found a couple of weeks ago on the internet was someone created a local test runner, local GitHub Actions runner. Did you try it already? Or?
So I've been aware of ACT for a while. I was actually trying to get it to work this morning. There's a couple of limitations that I found with it. It doesn't work very well in Windows 10. So one of the things that you can try, I attempted to do this morning was configure to run it in WSL, but I'm running into some weird issues. I can actually spin it up and kind of show you what Garrett is talking about, though. So inside of a terminal, I'm just going to connect to WSL, and I'm going to go over to that particular folder, and I think it was...
I will share a link on the
chat, please do. So if I go to here, so if I go to ACT-L, that'll show you the GitHub Action. ACT is the tool that you install. You can install it via Chocolatey, you can install it via Homebrew. There's a couple of different ways that you can install it, but it allows you to kind of have an experience where you can run your GitHub Actions locally. So I think it's ACT-N. Yeah, so that lets you do a dry run. So as you can see here, let me just zoom in here. So what this actually does is it kicks off a dry run just to make sure your GitHub Actions will work before you commit them. As you can see here, this one, it's failing to publish artifacts. I would probably need to take a look at as to why. But one thing that you can also do is you can actually just run ACT, and it will actually run the GitHub action locally. In my experience with this particular instance is that this will fail was because the actual runners that are existing inside the Docker containers, they don't have absolutely everything that the GitHub runners hosted do. So there's going to be a .NET Core exception here. Yep. So can find your ICU package. So I was trying to figure out how to resolve this inside of that, but I wasn't really successful before our talk. Yeah. But I imagine that it's one of the things that you could. Yeah, I think it's actually pretty cool. One of the things I was actually thinking about doing just to get a better understanding is actually spin up a real Linux VM and see if I could get it to work. Because obviously with WSL, I think there's a couple of limitations that doesn't work. I also have 18.04 of Ubuntu. I imagine maybe if you went to 20.04, it might work a little bit better. But at least one of the things that I do think is interesting about it is that it does give you an experience of, hey, I don't have to commit this action up to GitHub every time I want to test my changes. I could easily do it locally and see if it works. Because I know if anybody looks at any of my repos, there's a ton of commits just updating either GitHub Actions or YAML, just because, YAML syntax is hard. Also, like when you're, mucking with stuff, like you have no idea if it's going to work or not work depending on what variables you're passing in. But ACT is a pretty interesting tool. I'd like to see if I can get to work with, I can't get to work with Windows at all, but I can get at least this far in WSL, so I think that WSL is probably a better route. Would love to see if anybody has experience making this work on Windows 10. That'd be excellent to hear. But yeah, so that's that tool. I think that's kind of interesting. There's also some other interesting things as well. So I'm just going to open, that you brought that up, I'm just going to open, VS Code. And VS Code has a couple of kind of cool extensions that you can get for GitHub Actions. So one that I found that was pretty cool was this one. It's called GitHub Actions by Christopher Schleiden. But basically it gives you like autocomplete and some, gives you YAML linting, and you can actually go in and view the statuses of your workflows. So if I go here and go to GitHub Actions, I've already installed it. You can actually point it at a repository that already exists. Maybe. Don't know why that's not working. But it should, hopefully, configure. Let's just actually get a... Do I need to log into GitHub again? Yeah, GitHub Actions login. Oh, cool. Don't know why that's not working. It was working yesterday. Yeah, but anyway, it'll list out. Actually, maybe. Do I need to do this? Open a folder. Let me see if I can do it for a project that I know actually works. I'm gonna go here, GitHub Actions. Come on. Are you still gonna load?
Yeah, it's loading.
Yeah, it's doing something. It's probably not gonna work. Oh, it worked, right? So you can take a look. So you can actually see so if you have a self-hosted runner configured, you can see that. You can actually view your repository secrets if you have them. I do not think you can, you can actually view them, but you can edit them here, which is pretty valuable.
Yeah, nice.
And then you can actually see the outputs of your different workflows. So if I go in here, it'll actually link out to it directly. Or you can open this up and it'll show you inside of VS Code. And I'm sorry, my windows are so small, so. But you can actually see the logs here. Yeah, so instead of having to do everything out in the GitHub portal, you can actually do it here, which I thought was pretty interesting. And there's also some other cool features like I said, linting and autocomplete, which has helped me in the past trying to figure out, okay, how do I get this GitHub action to actually work?
Yeah, that's what I want as well. I don't want like 20 or 30 failed runs because your YAML's not correct, or all the stuff you have initially when you're setting up your CI/CD. Of course, you get stuff out of the box, but when you're creating some more complex workflows, you always get some indenting wrong or some other stuff. Then these tools are great.
Yeah, some indenting wrong, or even just like paths, right? Like, trying to get paths right. Like when you're, one of the things that I did a few months ago was configure CI/CD for like a WPF application, which included deploying to like the Windows Store, right? Like that was a super pain to try to get that to work, just because there's a lot of different configuration variables that exist there. But yeah, there are some tools that are really, really valuable to work with GitHub Actions. There's some in VS Code, there's some in Visual Studio, and obviously Visual Studio and VS Code, if you're deploying your stuff to Azure, it'll easily, set up kind of that scaffolded template, which allows you to, start from, 5 steps ahead instead of starting from 0. So I want to go back to the talk really quick. So talking about Azure Static Web Apps. So people who don't know what Azure Static Web Apps are, they're a feature that's available inside of App Service, which allows you to host static sites. So when you don't need a server at all, so not even going the path of serverless, where you're actually running server code in a managed environment, this is true server static, right? So if you have an HTML, JavaScript, and CSS solution, whether that's Angular or React, or in our case with .NET, if you have Blazor WebAssembly and you're building that out with or without an API, you can take advantage of Azure Static Web Apps to deploy your built code there. One of the really, really valuable things that I see with Azure Static Web Apps is that when you actually create the Azure Static Web App resource, it creates the CI/CD for you. And I'm going to show you what that looks like. And then finally, I think one thing that's super valuable is that you get free SSL certs with Azure Static Web Apps, which, web developers they know that SSL certs and trying to get them or trying to find ones that are cheaper, extremely challenging. So the ability to get free ones from Azure Static Web Apps is super awesome. So I'm just going to show you really quick in the portal what it looks like to build one out. So if I go to a resource here, and I'm just going to create a static web app resource, static web app, go to create, and then I'm just going to provide it a name like this. Let's just say Isaac Talk. Put a name. Pick a region for it. Let's do West US because that's where I live. Sign into GitHub. Sure. I will give Static Web Apps permission to hit my repo for the 400th time today. All right. So that's going to actually list out the organization, the repository, and the branch. So I'm going to pick my organization. I'm going to pick my repository, .NET Conf Demos, which is the one that I'm working with, and then the branch, so main. And then finally, the build details. So you can specify build presets. So if I look here, I can look at all these different frameworks. So if I ViewPress or Hugo or Gatsby, Angular, React, and I can just select Blazor, and it'll pre-populate basically the information that we need. So what actually happens here is that it uses a tool called Oryx, which basically builds it out for you. So you specify your location for your app, your API, if you have a backend API that you want to have, and then the artifacts. So if I click create here, it's going to create my Azure Static Web App resource. And then what you'll see is that when I go over, when this is done, when I go over to my GitHub repo, I'll see that a file has been added to the GitHub repo for me. And that file is going to be a GitHub action. So I can actually go to the resource. That's the URL that it created for me. And then I can go click edit workflow. So it'll take me over to the GitHub action that it created for that particular Azure Static Web App. So the CI/CD is created for you the second you create the application. You'll probably need to make a couple of changes here to get this to work. In the situation where I actually have a working copy here, so I can actually take this over and I'll edit this. Do a nice little replace, change this to main, and then as you can see, save this in there. And that will kick off all of the actions again because I haven't set up any conditional here. But it shows you that you can easily set up Azure Static Web Apps with the CI/CD already plugged in out of the box. So when we're all done, it'll deploy a built Blazor application to Azure Static Web Apps. So that's really, really cool. And I think that, Azure Static Web Apps to me is very, very interesting because it allows you to do very, very cool hosted things in a similar vein to other hosting platforms you have. If you're using Jamstack at all, Azure Static Web Apps is awesome, right? So to summarize, as we talk about kind of wrapping up my talk, GitHub Actions to me are a great solution to seamlessly configure your CI/CD on your GitHub repos without having to manage another tool. That's the big thing here. So if your code's already hosted in GitHub, taking advantage of GitHub Actions is extremely valuable. Building and deploying .NET Core applications is extremely painless with GitHub provided workflows and Azure product team provided workflows. So you don't have to do anything from scratch. There are tons of existing workflows that exist that allow you to fully extend out your CI/CD. And those custom workflows are built by the community. They're built by all sorts of different vendors as well if you have a more complex solution. And most of them include deployments to many different services, including ones in Azure. And from my personal opinion, is use GitHub Actions whenever you want to deploy ASP.NET Core to Azure and your code's hosted in GitHub. That's very opinionated, but that's just my personal thoughts. So thanks for joining, and I'll definitely take some questions. This is a link to a lot of the things that you've seen out here. I'll actually update some of the stuff in this URL link as well. So it uses URList behind the scenes, which is kind of like a bookmark manager. So I'll be adding some things to that. So, take a look, and obviously hit me up on Twitter if you have any questions about anything. But I'm definitely happy to take some questions now and have a great conversation.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for your talk. It was a learning experience. Well, I already played a lot with GitHub Actions, but I think for a lot of people, GitHub Actions is still really new. So it's really good to see what the options are there to go to Azure really fast. Esteban, you have some questions? Because
there's one question that comes up often when I work with different teams. How early or late in your development process do you set up your GitHub action to start deploying automatically into Azure?
Yeah, I'm probably going to get in trouble with a lot of my DevOps friends. I think Abel Wang, one of my friends, will say you need to do it immediately, right? And one of the things that I do as a part of my job is that we build out the storytelling from a technical standpoint for our events at Microsoft. So build, ignite. When you see keynotes and you see demos, like I'm part of the team that puts together those demos. So for instance, we just had Ignite in September. So I worked with Abel to do the Visual Studio and GitHub Code Spaces demo, right? So one of the things that we talked about there was basically how easy you can set up GitHub Actions from in Visual Studio, kind of like the demo that I just showed just now. And he says, like, every site deserves CI/CD. My opinion is a bit different. The first thing that I see is, okay, is this thing going to be deployed somewhere? If the answer is yes, I definitely set up my CI/CD as soon as possible, because I really get down this path of just forgetting to set up CI/CD and then having to do the publishing process over and over again manually, which is a pain. So my recommendation out of honesty is that if you think your code is going to be in Azure at some point in the future, set up the CI/CD as soon as you can. You don't need to add the workflow to deploy it to Azure, but you can do all the other things. You can do your build, you can do your test. If you're building stuff out in a different way, obviously take a look at that ACT tool so you can do some of these things locally instead of having to, constantly commit. But I guess the short answer to your question is pretty soon. I think it really just depends on what you're doing. If you're building a proof of concept, probably doesn't make sense. But if you're going to deploy it to Azure, you're going to have to deploy it more than once. Probably CI/CD, configuring GitHub Actions. This is so easy. It's probably straightforward enough for you to do it pretty quickly and right away.
Yeah, and if you're working in a team, I would rather have you do it immediately. You will profit for a long time if you just do it from the start. And all the stuff that Isaac showed, it's quite easy to do, at least from the beginning. Even if you don't have a deployment targets toward Azure or something, just building your code and having your tests run at every commit is just really valuable for quality of your code.
Yeah, and that leads me to something that I forgot to mention, but I just wanted to call out. So So if you've heard of Tailwind Traders or Rock Paper Scissors Spock, so I actually own these repos. So I manage the team that adds content to these particular demos and manages them. So we configured pretty early on GitHub Actions for all of our tools, right? So we, as a part of our workflow, we publish to AKS and we publish a regular app service. We have CodeQL, which does code scanning. So this shows you kind of a more, I guess you could say, detailed process. We're in the process of upgrading from .NET 3 to .NET 5 right now, so a lot of these workflows don't work currently. But as you can see, you can configure AKS, kubectl, you can call Docker and all sorts of different things, right? So it's not just as simple like, oh, I'm going to publish to app service, or oh, I'm going to do this little thing. Like you can have the full suite of things. You can build out Docker, you can deploy to Linux containers, pass them into Kubernetes, all sorts of really cool things. So GitHub Actions is pretty configurable in that way. And there's also some tools from a privacy standpoint that you can configure as well to make sure your deployments are safe. So if you have any questions about, okay, well, what's a more complicated example of a GitHub action, you can take a look at some of these repos. They don't work right now, but they will be working very shortly. I can promise you that.
Yeah, and the great thing about GitHub is it's open source. You can just search for other projects using actions, so you can just steal from them, right? And use them in your own projects.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is a tool that's widely. I think that even if you click on searching GitHub repos or GitHub actions, it'll tell you how they're being used. Maybe I'm mistaken there. Yeah, I think I'm wrong. I feel like at some point there was like a place that you can see like, oh, these are all of the repos that actually use this GitHub action, but I'm guessing that's probably not true. But obviously, if you go into GitHub Actions in the GitHub Marketplace, there's over almost 6,000 individual GitHub Actions that create. And if you search for Azure, there's almost 100 that are for Azure. And as you can see, a lot of them were actually published by the Azure team. So obviously, super awesome. And all these things are available on GitHub, like for you to look at. So you can actually go and look at the source code for this particular GitHub action, and you can see exactly what it's doing. It's not just a black box where you say, okay, pass my things into this thing and it's going to do it. It shows you all the things you're building out the container and injecting all the different things, which I think is pretty valuable for you to get a better understanding of how you can leverage GitHub Actions and create your own if you want to.
Yeah, but even if you just search, you add a task to your pipeline. If you just search for that task name on GitHub globally, you will find other workflows that use it.
Yeah.
Because you can just search through everyone's repos, right? So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, so I love GitHub Actions. I think it's super awesome. One of the things that I'm looking to do, very soon is I have a lot of other things that are currently in Azure pipelines because I have some code that's in Azure repos. And eventually, I think I'm going to, want to move a lot of that stuff to open to make sure that people can see it and take full advantage of it. So, migrating that stuff over to GitHub and setting up GitHub Actions is going to be a fun task for me.
Yeah, very cool.
Awesome.
Esteban, your final thoughts?
No, this is really cool stuff. I think it's been great to see the progression that Actions has made and how easy it is for people who are trying to get into this to do it. As you showed, I know there's some people still out there who are a little bit afraid to jump into the CI/CD world. Because typically, as you talked about early, it wasn't easy, and now the tools are there and the practices are there. So it's great to see this. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I think one of the things that I think is extremely valuable about DevOps in general is that it can't be scary for people, right? And I think that a lot of people are scared of YAML, which I think is a pretty fair thing because YAML is a bit different than how a lot of other, I guess you could say, configuration type files are kind of structured. But if you can get comfortable with YAML syntax and just the thought of being able to, like Garrett said, like you have a team, it's super valuable for everybody on the team to be able to know how to build the code and do exactly what it takes to get to production easily, right? And I think that, there's tons of tools that Microsoft builds out to make it easy for you, right? Visual Studio, VS Code, these things are here to help. And yeah, I think one of the things that's super valuable about DevOps in general is it's just empowering developers to not have to worry about all sorts of meaningless tasks, right? Like deploying code should be a meaningless task. That's why a robot can do it. Yeah, that's my 2 cents on it.
Well, thanks again for your talk then. And everyone else, thanks for watching. We had a sneak peek for .NET Conf where Isaac will also do this session, I think. So
much shorter though. I gotta shorten this talk a lot, I think. So
okay, yeah.
So I think the GitHub or the .NET Conf talk is like 25 minutes, and I think I went about 35. So I got to figure out where to cut some time. So that's some fun things to do for me for the next couple of weeks.
Okay, well, good luck on that talk at .NET Conf, and thanks for being here tonight, your afternoon. Well, hopefully to see you again someday, or maybe at a real life conference when that's possible again.
Yeah, no, that would be awesome. This was great. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I'm more than excited to talk to you folks in the future.
Okay. Well, see you around, everyone. Thanks for watching. If you liked it, please subscribe, like the video.